I'm sure Andrew would love to be remembered as fun, beautiful, and charming. I think that's certainly how I'll remember him. I recall walking into the cinema the first time and I was really unsure whether I was going to like this guy. Before I met Andrew, I was previously happy and content with Toby, and from what I'd heard and seen of Andrew, I thought he might be a pretty boy and not someone who I'd want to spend my time with. I'm sure Andrew is having a good laugh at this right now because how wrong I was. Andrew earned my trust, my devotion, and my love rather quickly. After meeting for the first time, I felt happy. Happier than I've felt in years. And I'll never forget that. We didn't keep in touch, but I kept checking in to see how he and Emma were doing now and again, and I could see that they were blossoming into a wonderful couple. But not all of these things work out, and I just want to say to Emma, no hard feelings. It wasn't for a few years after that until I saw him again. I was excited, nervous and giddy all at the same time. It was a wonderful feeling. After our second meeting was when I knew Andrew had a special place in my heart. A lot of people went off him at that point, but for me, he was just the same old beautiful Andrew. I'm going to miss him dearly. I already do. He was my saint, my superhero, my Spider-Man.
What's up, guys? Wait a minute. You guys aren't the real Avengers. I can tell Hulk gives it away. Oh, that was awesome.
Hello, and welcome to Film Rant. It's the big one, guys. Marvel's MCU stab at Spider-Man, directed by John Watts. We got a glimpse of the new Spidey in Civil War, and I'll admit, I wasn't all that sold on what I saw, but I was fully prepared and intrigued to see how Tom Holland fills the boots of everyone's favourite web-slinger. So has this new Spidey stuck? Well, to answer that, I will be swinging into spoiler territory, so web shoot your way down to the cinema if you don't want anything spoiled. So our new Peter Parker is played by Tom Holland, who's basically Jamie Bell 10 years ago. Some of you may be familiar with my Civil War review where I expressed less than favourable impressions of Holland. I thought he was too childish, looked too young, and just didn't really feel like a Peter Parker to me. He is still all of those things in Homecoming, but the script works with all of this, which I thought was magnificent. If Tom Holland was in a straight-up Spider-Man film, either by Raimi or Mark Webb and following the usual formula, I don't think he'd work. Holland is incredibly teenage, high-pitched and whiny at times, but the script uses this as one of its central themes. Because he works with the script so well, I think Holland's version of Peter Parker is actually quite brilliant. I'm nervous to see how it'll play out in a sequel where the main theme of the movie is probably going to be different, but for now, I'm satisfied. Even if his high-pitched voice and incessant fast-talking got a bit grating by the end of the long 2 hours 13 runtime. As for Michael Keaton reimbursing his role as Birdman, I was happy enough with him. For a majority of the movie I thought he was an extremely weak villain, not in the sense of his powers or threat, but more that his character was totally underdeveloped. However, in the latter stages of the film, his character really gets shown. He kills a guy early on, and this would be fine if he was a mass murderer like Green Goblin, but he just seems to be a family man who has a personal score to settle with society. He's shafted time and time again by people richer than he is, and he just wants a life for his family, so he turns to crime. That would be somewhat acceptable in and of itself, but when you throw murder into the mix, it totally changes his character. Granted, the early kill is accidental, but he doesn't really seem to be bothered by it. He then says he's going to kill Spider-Man when he gets in his way. However, for the rest of the movie, I'm pretty sure he doesn't actually kill anybody else at all. He's one of the few villains that actually just seems like he's all talk. I don't genuinely believe that Keaton does want to kill Spidey, as we see in the post-credit scene where he could sell him down the river, but he doesn't. Which, by the way, was reminiscent of the JJ scene in Spider-Man 1 where he keeps Parker's identity to himself while being threatened by the Green Goblin. Both of these scenes show the true characters of those in it, and Keaton probably is a good guy in a sense, and I think the movie wanted you to think that, but it just didn't quite work for me. The guy's an arms dealer at the end of the day. He terrorizes people and sells weapons to criminals. Sure, he's similar to Tony Stark in the sense that they both sell arms, but Tony Stark realises he's completely in the wrong line of work and stops selling arms, instead using his wealth and knowledge to make defence systems like the Iron Man suits in Ultron. Yeah, Ultron went apeshit, but at least he tried. Tony is still an arms dealer in the sense that he makes Iron Man suits to defend the world, but it's a form of redemption. At no point do I think that Keaton regrets anything he's done. Maybe a little bit in the post-credit scene, but I feel that we aren't done with Keaton in this franchise, so we'll see what happens in a few years. Aunt May was probably the worst character in the movie for me. I didn't like her at all. I did sort of like that the script seemed to make jokes out of the fact that she's smoking hot, but that also harmed the character. It was fun to see some of the Stifler's mom-style jokes that were said by the deli owner and some of Peter's friends, but in the scenes where it was just Peter and her, it left a sour taste. I feel like May was far too sexualized and that Marisa Tomei and Tom Holland's chemistry was just non-existent. So when we had those scenes where she's meant to be quite motherly to him, it just came across as completely flat. Tobey Maguire and Rosemary Harris and Andrew Garfield and Sally Field had brilliant chemistry and both pairs exhibited a very endearing mother-son style relationship. I thought Marisa Tomei was very cold and insincere towards Peter. She seems about as genuine as an episode of Love Island, and that's a big fault for the Aunt May character. If she was completely cut from the next movie, I'd be happy with that. Peter's friend Ned, played by Jacob Batalon, offered some great comic relief. He was the typical Jonah Hill character, you know, the fat funny friend, but I was happy that the movie actually gave him some purpose in the plot. He helps Peter track down the arms dealers and he even saves his life at one point by intercepting Shocker. Batalon gave a very funny performance too and his comedic timing was spot on. As for Peter's love interest and future love interests, Liz and MJ respectively, I didn't mind them. Both of them just crop up in the movie now and then, but never really get interesting enough to talk about. I'd be disappointed if we've seen the last of Liz, but we've definitely not seen the last of MJ, so I'll make up my mind on her after the sequel. As for the script, I really enjoyed how fresh this take on Spider-Man was. Now you all know I'm a big fan of the Garfield films, yes, even the second one, but I'm fully aware that Amazing Spider-Man 1 covered very familiar territory in terms of the origin story and style. This was a big turn-off for a lot of people and I totally get it. If that was the case for you, then you'll be pleased to know that the MCU Spider-Man is an entirely different beast. Sure, you can compare the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies, but I feel this version is in a totally different area. We got to see so many new things, such as Spidey handling really low-level crime fighting, sometimes even attacking innocent people by accident, which was hilarious. We got to see him struggle in rural or suburban areas, which was great. We see him interact with all of the Stark tech, so this version of Spidey has so many more toys to play with. The biggest change I thought was that we got to see Spider-Man outside of New York City. There's a section where he has to save his friends trapped inside the Washington statue, which I thought was refreshing to watch. Even the characters are different. Yeah, we have some returning characters such as Flash and MJ, but we've never seen Liz or Ned before. We've never seen Shocker or Vulture before. And there wasn't a single mention of Harry Osborn, Norman Osborn or Oscorp, who all seem to have dominated Spider-Man movies in the past. You can't say that Spider-Man Homecoming doesn't tread new ground, because it absolutely does and it's damn good to see. Even the style of the movie is different. The previous entries followed a set formula with little tweaks here and there, but Homecoming is far from a typical superhero movie. It's about 50% Superbad style coming of age film and 50% MCU movie. I would have liked that balance tipped a little bit heavier on the Superbad side, but I'm happy with what we got. I complained that Peter was too young and just seemed far too teenage, and a lot of people thought that at first. It seems that Marvel listened to that feedback and wrote a script to incorporate this in it. Peter is very much burdened by the fact he's a teenager. He has school troubles, he's constantly reminded he's just a kid and inexperienced, which shows him to be completely outclassed when fighting Vulture. It was nice to see Spidey bogged down by problems of growing up and being totally out of his depth. We got to see Tobey Maguire deal with personal responsibility in his trilogy, but he was a guy very much in his late teens or early 20s and had entirely different problems. Garfield's personal issues weren't really much more than relationship troubles and he seemed quite competent at everything he did. Tom Holland's Spider-Man is somewhat weak, naive and completely underskilled for the job. It's two coming-of-age stories in one. He's learning to be an adult with responsibility and he's also learning how to hone his Spider-Man skills to become a better hero, to become an Avenger. It's not perfect though. I think they could have done a little more with this theme. There's a scene late in the movie where Michael Keaton is sat with Peter in his car and he knows Peter is Spider-Man. He pulls a gun, turns round and looks him right in the eyes and says something along the lines of, "Leave this car and forget all of this ever happened. If you get in my way again, I will kill you and kill everyone you love." Now if I was a 15-year-old kid, Spider-Man or not, I would be fucking terrified of this guy. I don't know what he's capable of. He's much older than me, he's probably killed people before, and he has a fucking flying vulture suit. I would have loved it if this scene had came much earlier in the movie and Spider-Man was partially defeated by a threat. Superheroes always shrug off threats or find some way to negate the consequences. I'd have been ecstatic if Peter got out the car, went into the ball with a face like a smacked arse and went home and moped a bit. He knows he has to fight him because he's Spider-Man and Keaton is his love's dad, which seemed like a bit of a ridiculous plot convenience if I'm being honest, and he wants her to have a better life. So he knows he has to fight him, but he should be absolutely shit scared. We get it a little bit when he gets out the car and slowly walks up to the doors and looks terrified, but it's not only a minute later where he runs out of the back to fight Keaton. I think it would have been better if a bigger portion of the movie was about Spidey finding courage to fight the villain. Most superhero movies focus on the hero trying to outsmart and figure out the villain. They're perfectly comfortable fighting them, but they're just beaten by intellect or raw power more often than not. If Spidey was beaten by fear for a long time, I would have given this movie a straight up 5 out of 5. I've never seen a Marvel superhero be genuinely terrified of a villain before, because it probably wouldn't work with a much more mature character, but Peter is a 15-year-old school kid being threatened by a powerful murderer he doesn't know who has a mechanical vulture suit and countless henchmen. I'd be fucking terrified. Homecoming really leans on the outside MCU in this movie. They reference the Avengers in this movie like there's no tomorrow, even when it's not entirely necessary, such as the scene with the bank robbers wearing Avengers masks. It was good for comic relief, but it also came across as a weak attempt at intertextuality. However, much like the teenage Spidey, Marvel weave the Avengers references into the storyline itself. After all, it's a story about Peter desperately wanting to become an Avenger and learning to become one. Some of you may be pleased to know that there was significantly less Tony Stark than expected. There were fears that this was going to be a Spider-Iron Man movie as opposed to a flat-out Spider-Man movie, but this isn't the case. Stark has just the right amount of screen time and input to the plot. He just watches Peter from afar. I actually think Jon Favreau has more screen time than Robert Downey Jr. in this movie, and that's not a bad thing for me. I love Jon Favreau. Off the back of that, I do want to mention a little thing that annoyed me with this movie. Now, we've had countless Marvel movies since the first iteration of the Defenders Netflix TV series and Daredevil, but none of these movies have ever mentioned these heroes. I can understand why they wouldn't, because the characters often have huge problems to deal with and they haven't been in New York recently. In this movie though, it's set in New York and the villain is in New York and Spider-Man isn't even at Avenger level yet. I feel like Peter could have at least mentioned Jessica Jones or something. Maybe I've got the timeline wrong, maybe Daredevil and co aren't even around yet, but there's a scene where Peter asks Tony why the Avengers won't help him take down Vulture and Tony says it's a little below their pay grade. It would have been cool if Tony said something like, why don't you get that blind guy from Hell's Kitchen to help you? Or if Peter said, maybe I could find Jessica and see if she'd help. Just a little line of dialogue to recognise that these characters exist in the universe. The TV shows reference the movies, so why does it never happen the other way around? As a big fan of the Netflix shows, this really pisses me off. Surprisingly, there is no visual origin story in this movie. Peter simply tells Ned that he got bit by a spider and that's it. We don't see anything and we don't hear any more of it for the rest of the movie. We also don't see Uncle Ben get murdered, and I don't think he's even mentioned by name in the movie at all. Peter explains this by simply saying to Ned, you can't mention I'm Spider-Man to May. She's been through enough lately, you know? Or something along those lines. I like this. We're told how he makes his web and we know that Tony made his suit, so that's all the questions answered. It's easy to miss these short lines of dialogue, but I really like that they didn't dedicate a big chunk of the movie to an origin story. If it's not all that different to the origin story we already know, then why bother shooting it? Just mention it and move on. Big props to the scriptwriters for this. They pulled it off. There is a big issue that comes in pretty much the very first scene though. Keaton is a contracted construction worker or some kind of demolition removal worker or something along those lines, and he's been contracted to remove the alien tech left over from the Battle of New York. His operation gets hijacked by the Department of Damage Control and they ask him to hand over all of the alien tech he's collected so far. He decides to steal some and make weapons out of it for the next 8 years. Now that works fine for the plot, but I do have a bit of trouble believing that he could actually get away with stealing the tech. Firstly, I think the DDC would have thoroughly searched him and his colleagues to make sure they actually had handed everything over, and secondly, the moment any of these alien weapons started showing up on the streets, he'd be the #1 target of the government. They do try to intercept him on the Staten Island ferry, but then they just seem to forget he exists again and he can still live comfortably at home. It's not an absolute deal breaker, but it is an issue with the plot I thought was worth pointing out. The comedy in Homecoming is very good. Some highlights include the interrogation mode on Spidey's suit, which changes his voice to pretty much match Christian Bale's Batman. I thought that was an excellent parody, and that scene was made better by the incredibly talented Donald Glover's reactions to it. Just so you guys know, Donald Glover is also my boy now, so I'll add him to the list. Ned offered some brilliant comedy too, constantly asking Peter questions. We'd all ask Spider-Man if we knew him. Tom Holland himself was very funny at times with his energetic performance, and I absolutely loved how they used Captain America. Showing his generic and aimless school videos was hilarious. They made him sound like such a smarmy and self-righteous prick, which is not unfamiliar in the MCU. The final post-credit scene was a good laugh too, where Cap is talking about patience and being disappointed after he waited so long for something. It was nice to see Marvel take the piss out of itself a lot in this movie. The writers really nailed the comedy, and John Watts nailed the direction of it. As for the technical aspects of the movie, it was a little disappointing that Spider-Man wasn't really given a theme. I mean, that's hardly surprising as none of the MCU heroes really have their own theme. They have leitmotifs like AC/DC with Iron Man and classic hits with Guardians of the Galaxy, but the soundtrack for Homecoming really lacked any form of identity, which was disappointing. The cinematography was decent though. There's some wonderful cityscape shots and decent lighting. I especially like the scene where Keaton was driving Peter and Liz to the ball and he stopped at a red light. The red light was shining on his face as he was figuring out Peter was Spidey, and once the penny dropped, the light turned to green. That looks so damn cool. It also helps that the cinematography is helped by decent enough visual effects. They're nothing to write home about, but there's nothing here that looks like a sex doll in a lineup of Kardashians, so there'll be no complaints from me. So overall, Spider-Man Homecoming is the most refreshing Spider-Man movie to come out since the very first Tobey Maguire version. It's full of new content, new characters and new locations, while also having the ability to lean on aspects of the wider MCU when needed. The tone of the movie is more of a teenage coming-of-age story than an outright superhero movie, and I think that works incredibly well given that Tom Holland looks like he should still be in primary school, even though he's only like 4 years younger than me, but whatever. Keaton portrays a fairly decent and competent villain, but a one that could have been done much better and much clearer. I think the movie got a bit muddled in how it wanted the audience to interpret him, and it ended up not going in any real direction. There's a couple of little niggles with some plot conveniences and the fact that they never mention the stellar Netflix shows, but they aren't my main gripes with the movie. Spider-Man Homecoming is one of those movies that almost achieves greatness but just misses the mark on a few things. While it was refreshing to see lots of new things and have an entirely different tone for the movie, it still didn't do anything narratively to really wow me. I would have liked Spider-Man to have been a little bit more out of his depth and a little more scared. That's basically the consensus of this review. Everything Spider-Man Homecoming does is right, it just needed that little bit extra to really push it into the realms of superhero movie legends. It's the cinematic equivalent of a good cheeseburger. It's wonderful to experience and there's some nice additions to enjoy, but it really could have done with some barbecue sauce and a few slices of pepperoni. I'm hungry now. Spider-Man Homecoming gets 3.5 frames out of 5. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Film Rant.